A disheveled kid hesitantly stepped into the most prestigious bank in the entire city. "I just want to check my balance," he mumbled, barely audible. The millionaire banker, a picture of arrogance, erupted in laughter at the sight of him. But the moment the screen illuminated with the account details, his smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. The morning sun glinted off the sleek glass towers of Manhattan's financial district, bathing the city in a warm, golden light. It was a world that Marcus had only ever observed from the fringes. At the tender age of 12, he understood a harsh reality. This city was divided into two distinct groups: those who belonged inside magnificent buildings like these, and those who quietly cleaned them after everyone else had gone home for the night. Today, however, Marcus was about to defy that invisible boundary for the very first time. His oversized sneakers, held together by strips of duct tape, squeaked uncomfortably against the polished marble floor as he pushed through the heavy, revolving doors of Blackwell and Associates private banking. The rush of air conditioning hit him like a physical force, a stark contrast to the oppressive summer heat he'd just endured outside, where he'd spent the last 3 hours summoning the courage to even approach the building. The lobby was unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined, let alone seen in person. Towering marble columns stretched an astounding 30 feet towards the ceiling, supporting a surface adorned with what appeared to be genuine gold leaf. Crystal chandeliers, each likely worth more than his entire neighborhood combined, cast a soft, inviting glow across exquisitely crafted leather furniture that seemed too pristine to even consider sitting on. The air itself hummed with an expensive aroma, a delicate blend of fresh flowers, meticulously polished wood, and something else, something intangible he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the scent of money, of success, of belonging, things he had never truly known. Marcus clutched the worn envelope tightly in his pocket, feeling the familiar, reassuring edge of the bank card nestled inside. His fingers were undeniably dirty. There had been no running water in his building for 3 long days, and he was acutely aware of the stubborn smudge of grime on his face that he had desperately, but unsuccessfully, tried to wash off at a public fountain that morning. "May I help you?" The voice came from an impeccably dressed woman stationed behind a sleek, minimalist reception desk. She was looking at him with the same mixture of pity and disdain that people in this part of the city always seemed to reserve for him, as if he were some unwelcome creature that had accidentally wandered in off the street. Marcus's voice emerged as a mere whisper. He cleared his throat self-consciously and tried again, projecting his voice. "I need to check my balance." The woman's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched slightly in surprise. "I'm sorry, young man, but this is a private banking institution. Perhaps you're looking for the branch bank down on—" "I have an account here," Marcus interrupted immediately, regretting the desperate edge in his tone. "I have a card." He pulled out the envelope with trembling hands, carefully extracting the sleek black card that had mysteriously arrived in his mailbox 6 months prior. He'd been too afraid to use it until now, consumed by the fear that it might be some sort of mistake, a cruel joke that would ultimately land him in trouble. But yesterday, when Mrs. Chun from the corner store had regretfully told him that she couldn't extend him any more credit, he had realized he had no other choice. The receptionist's expression underwent a subtle but noticeable shift, morphing from dismissive disdain to genuine confusion as she examined the card. It was undeniably from this bank. The logo was unmistakable. However, Marcus could clearly see her struggling to reconcile the reality of a kid who looked like he'd been sleeping under a bridge possessing an account at one of the most exclusive banking institutions in all of New York. "I see," she said slowly, her tone suggesting that she saw absolutely nothing at all. "Well, you'll need to speak with one of our account managers. If you'll just wait over there." She gestured vaguely towards a plush seating area, but Marcus barely registered her words. His attention had been completely captivated by the imposing figure of a man striding purposefully across the lobby with an air of absolute ownership. According to the gleaming nameplate on the massive desk he was approaching, he basically did own the place. Richard Blackwell. Even Marcus, who knew next to nothing about the world of high finance, had heard of Richard Blackwell. His face was plastered on billboards all across the city, always sporting the same confident, almost arrogant smile that seemed to proclaim that he had never known a single moment of doubt or hardship in his entire privileged life. At the age of 45, he was widely regarded as one of the most successful private bankers in the entire country, entrusted with managing the vast fortunes of celebrities, tech moguls, and old money families whose wealth stretched back to before the American Revolution itself. He wore a flawlessly tailored suit that probably cost more than Marcus's mom used to make in an entire year. His shoes were so immaculately polished that Marcus could see the shimmering reflection of the chandelier dancing in their surface. His carefully styled silver hair was arranged in a way that appeared effortlessly casual, but was clearly the result of meticulous effort. And his watch. Marcus had seen enough luxury watches displayed in store windows to immediately recognize a Patek Philippe, a timepiece that could easily feed every kid in his entire building for a whole month. Richard Blackwell was everything that Marcus was not: powerful, respected, untouchable. And right now, he was staring directly at Marcus with an undisguised expression of amused disgust. "Janet?" Richard called out to the receptionist, his voice effortlessly projecting across the lobby with the casual authority of someone who had never been ignored in his life. "Is there a reason we're allowing street children into the building? I thought we had security for this sort of thing." The words struck Marcus like a physical blow, stealing his breath. Around the lobby, other clients, all impeccably dressed in expensive suits and designer dresses, turned to stare, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Marcus felt his face burning with a potent cocktail of shame and anger that made his eyes sting. "Sir, the young man claims he has an account," Janet began, her voice hesitant. "An account?" Richard's laugh was sharp and cruel, devoid of any warmth. "Look at him, Janet. He's got dirt smeared all over his face, and his clothes look like they came straight from a dumpster. The only account he's familiar with is probably the one his parents opened at the local liquor store." More laughter rippled through the lobby, spreading like an infectious disease. A woman wearing an ostentatious pearl necklace covered her mouth with a manicured hand, her eyes sparkling with malicious delight. A man in a three-piece suit shook his head in mock dismay, muttering something to his companion about the neighborhood going downhill. Marcus wanted desperately to run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, push back through those revolving doors, and never, ever return. He had been foolish to think he could ever belong here, even for 5 fleeting minutes. He had been incredibly stupid to believe that a simple card in an envelope could somehow magically change anything about who he was or where he came from. But then he thought about Mrs. Chen's apologetic face. He thought about the looming eviction notice plastered on his door. He thought about his little sister, Emma, who had asked him that morning if they would have dinner that night, and the way his stomach had clenched when he'd been forced to admit that he simply didn't know. And then, most importantly, he thought about his mother. "I have a card," Marcus said again, his voice louder this time, laced with newfound determination. His voice still shook slightly, betraying his fear, but he forced himself to take a step forward, to walk across that impossibly perfect marble floor toward Richard Blackwell's imposing desk. "I just want to check my balance." Richard's expression shifted from amused to openly irritated. Clearly, he had fully expected Marcus to crumble under the pressure and flee the scene in tears. The fact that this dirty, insignificant kid was actually approaching him seemed to offend him on a deeply personal level. "Security!" Richard called out sharply, but then held up a hand when 2 uniformed guards started moving purposefully toward them. A new, unreadable expression flickered across his face. It wasn't quite curiosity. It was something more predatory, like a cat that had cornered a mouse and was relishing the opportunity to play with it before delivering the final blow. "Actually, wait," Richard said, a slow, chilling smile spreading across his face. "This could be rather entertaining." He leaned back expansively in his luxurious leather chair, steepling his fingers in front of him in a gesture of mock thoughtfulness. "Come here, boy. Let's see this account of yours." Marcus walked forward, his legs feeling like they might buckle beneath him at any moment. He could feel every single pair of eyes in the lobby boring into him, scrutinizing him, judging him, and ultimately finding him utterly lacking. His oversized sneakers seemed impossibly loud against the unforgiving marble. The envelope clutched tightly in his hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. When he finally reached Richard's desk, he had to tilt his head back to meet the banker's cold, appraising eyes. Richard was still smiling, but it was not a kind smile. It was the calculating smile of someone who was about to thoroughly enjoy themselves at someone else's expense. "Let me guess," Richard said, his voice deliberately loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear every word. "You found this card in the trash? Or maybe you stole it from someone's mailbox. That's a federal crime, you know. I could have you arrested right now." "I didn't steal it," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with a surprising amount of defiance. "It came to my apartment. My name is on it." "Your name is on it?" Richard repeated mockingly, dripping with sarcasm. "And what might that name be? Should I be expecting a trust fund baby hiding under all that dirt?" "Marcus," he said, projecting his voice with the best attempt he could muster. "Marcus Chun." Richard's fingers flew across his keyboard with practiced ease, his expression one of exaggerated patience, like a parent humoring a child's wildly ridiculous story. "Marcus Chen," he repeated, drawing out the syllables for effect. "Well, let's see what we find, shall we? I'm sure this will be absolutely fascinating." The typing seemed to stretch on for an eternity, each click of the keys echoing loudly in the sudden silence. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears like a drum. Around the lobby, people had stopped even pretending to mind their own business. They were all openly watching, eagerly waiting to see this poor, unfortunate kid get exposed as a thief, a liar, or whatever other convenient label Richard Blackwell decided to slap on him. Marcus's hand instinctively went to his pocket, seeking reassurance from the only other thing he always carried with him: a small, worn photograph of his mother. She was smiling radiantly in the picture, taken back before she got sick, back when she still genuinely believed that working 3, or sometimes even 4, grueling jobs might somehow be enough to build a better life for her children. She'd been tragically wrong about that, but maybe, just maybe, she'd been right about something else. Richard's fingers abruptly stopped typing. His eyes locked onto the screen, and for just a fleeting fraction of a second, Marcus saw his confident, almost arrogant expression falter. It was barely noticeable, just a slight widening of the eyes, a tiny tightening around the mouth, but it was undeniably there. Then, the professional mask slammed back into place with a visible force, and Richard's smile grew even wider. But this time, it felt forced and unnatural. Well, Richard said, his voice now dripping with false sweetness and mock surprise. "It appears you do have an account, Marcus Chin. How about that?" He paused dramatically, milking the moment for all it was worth, reveling in the attention he was commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a genuine client among us." He paused for added effect. "The account shows a balance of—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes darting back to the screen in disbelief. This time, the flicker of surprise lingered longer, and his smile froze on his face, taking on a distinctly strained quality. "The balance shows—" Richard tried again, but his voice had noticeably lost some of its mocking certainty. Marcus watched, fascinated, as the banker's face went through a rapid series of dramatic transformations. Confusion, disbelief, shock, and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "That's impossible," Richard whispered so quietly that only Marcus could hear the words. "That's absolutely impossible." Richard Blackwell had witnessed many extraordinary things in his 23 years of private banking. He'd watched tech entrepreneurs become billionaires overnight. He'd seen old fortunes crumble into dust and new ones rise from the ashes. He'd witnessed the kind of obscene wealth that most people couldn't even begin to imagine, the kind that existed in a completely different reality from the mundane world where normal people worried about paying rent and putting food on the table. But he had never, not once in his entire career, seen anything remotely like what was currently displayed on his computer screen. The number simply didn't make any sense. Couldn't possibly be real. It had to be a glitch in the system, some kind of inexplicable error that would be corrected as soon as their IT department inevitably noticed it. because there was absolutely no conceivable way that this disheveled, dirty kid standing right in front of him, this child who looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in weeks, could possibly have that kind of money in an account. There seems to be a technical issue, Richard said carefully, struggling to keep his professional mask firmly in place despite the utter chaos churning within his mind. The system is showing, well, it's clearly displaying incorrect information. What does it say? Marcus asked, his voice small and uncertain, barely audible. Richard looked at the boy. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time that day. The dirt on his face wasn't just smudge marks from playing outside. It was the kind of ingrained grime that accumulated when you didn't have reliable access to clean water. His clothes weren't just old or unfashionable. They were literally falling apart, held together by a patchwork of visible repairs. The duct tape on his shoes wasn't a fleeting fashion statement or even a temporary fix. It was a permanent, desperate solution to a problem that couldn't be solved any other way. This was a child living in abject poverty, the kind of poverty that Richard had spent his entire life meticulously insulated from, the kind he'd maybe seen in sobering documentaries, but never had to personally confront. And according to the screen in front of him, this child had an account balance of $47 million. "Janet?" Richard called out, trying desperately to keep his voice steady and authoritative. "Can you come here for a moment, please?" The receptionist hurried over, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell? I need you to verify something on your terminal. Look up the account for Marcus Chin." He spelled out the account number slowly and precisely, watching her face with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Janet's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. Richard saw the exact moment when she found the account. Her eyes widened in stunned disbelief, and all the color visibly drained from her face. "Sir," she whispered, leaning in close so that only he could hear, "the balance shows. I know what it shows. The question is whether you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing, or if this is isolated to my terminal." Richard cut her off sharply. "It's the same," Janet confirmed, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. $3 million. Last deposit was 6 months ago. No withdrawals, no activity of any kind since the account was opened. Richard's mind was racing, desperately trying to find a logical explanation, some way to make sense of this impossible situation. This had to be some kind of elaborate money laundering operation. Or maybe the account belonged to the kid's parents, and they were hardened criminals who'd cynically set up the account in their innocent son's name to hide their ill-gotten assets. That had to be it. There was simply no other rational explanation. "Marcus?" Richard said, his tone shifting abruptly to something more serious, more demanding. "I need you to be very honest with me. Where did you get this card?" "It came in the mail," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. 6 months ago. There was a letter with it." "A letter from whom?" "From my mom." Marcus's voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the raw emotion he was trying so hard to suppress. The lobby, which had been buzzing with curious whispers just moments before, fell suddenly and completely silent. Richard felt something deeply uncomfortable twist in his chest. Something that might have been shame, though he quickly and vehemently pushed the unwelcome emotion away. "I see," Richard said carefully, choosing his words with uncharacteristic caution. "And your mother was?" "A cleaning lady," Marcus said, lifting his chin slightly in defiance of the condescending pity that Richard was clearly expecting him to feel. "She worked 3 jobs, sometimes 4. She cleaned offices at night, worked at a laundromat during the day, and did whatever else she could find." That made even less sense. A cleaning lady with $47 million? Unless, Marcus, is it possible your mother was involved in something illegal? Richard asked, trying to sound diplomatic rather than accusatory, though he knew he was failing miserably. Sometimes people in difficult financial situations make choices that... "My mom wasn't a criminal," Marcus said sharply, his voice suddenly filled with more force and conviction than he'd shown since entering the building. "She was the best person I ever knew. She worked herself to death trying to give me and my sister a better life. Richard noticed the other clients in the lobby shifting uncomfortably, their gazes averted. The woman with the pearl necklace who'd been laughing earlier was now staring intently at her shoes. The man in the three-piece suit had turned away, suddenly very interested in something on his phone. "Of course," Richard said smoothly, backpedaling rapidly. "I didn't mean to suggest. Look, why don't we move this conversation to somewhere more private?" Richard suggested, attempting to regain some semblance of control over the increasingly volatile situation. "Janet, can you escort Mr. Chun to conference room B? Actually," a new voice cut in smooth and authoritative. "I'll take it from here." Richard looked up to see James Morrison, one of the bank's senior account managers, striding purposefully across the lobby toward them. James was 63 years old, had been with the bank for over 30 years, and had a well-deserved reputation for being both extremely competent and completely unimpressed by Richard's usual theatrics. "James, I'm handling this," Richard said, trying to inject some much-needed authority back into his voice. "No, Richard, you're making a scene," James replied calmly, his gaze unwavering. "And you're about to make a very serious mistake." He turned to Marcus with an expression that was actually kind. The first truly kind expression the boy had seen since stepping foot inside this intimidating building. "Hello, Marcus. My name is James Morrison. Would you mind coming with me? We can sort all of this out in a more comfortable setting." Marcus looked back and forth between the two men, clearly unsure of who to trust. Finally, hesitantly, he nodded. As James gently led Marcus toward the elevators, Richard felt his carefully constructed control of the situation slipping rapidly away. He stood up quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "James, I really think I should be present for." "You've done enough, Richard," James said without even bothering to look back. "Stay here and attend to your other clients. I'll handle this." Richard watched helplessly as James and Marcus disappeared into the elevator, the doors sliding silently shut behind them. Around him, the lobby remained eerily silent. Everyone had witnessed his humiliating treatment of a 12-year-old boy, who, it turned out, apparently had more money than most of Richard's regular, highly valued clients. He sat back down heavily at his desk, struggling to regain his composure, but he could still feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes boring into the back of his neck, could sense the palpable judgment hanging in the air. For the first time in years, Richard Blackwell felt something he thought he'd left behind in his childhood, something he desperately didn't want to acknowledge. Shame. Upstairs, in a comfortable conference room with soft, diffused lighting and carefully chosen furniture that actually looked inviting, James Morrison was making Marcus feel something he hadn't felt since entering the bank. Safe. "First things first," James said, pouring Marcus a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on the table. "Are you hungry? I can have someone bring up some food." Marcus's stomach growled audibly, answering the question with an embarrassing lack of subtlety. He nodded, his cheeks flushing with shame. James picked up the phone and ordered sandwiches, fresh fruit, and cookies. "Enough for 3 people, he specified to the person on the other end of the line, even though there were only 2 of them in the room. When he hung up, he settled comfortably into the chair across from Marcus, offering him a gentle, reassuring smile. "Better?" he asked, his voice soft. "Why are you being nice to me?" Marcus asked suspiciously, his defenses immediately rising. "Everyone else here looks at me like I'm trash. Because, unlike Richard Blackwell, I actually remember what it's like to have nothing," James said simply, his gaze direct and honest. "I grew up in the Bronx in the 60s. My father was a bus driver. My mother cleaned houses. I was the first person in my family to ever go to college, and I only managed to do that because of scholarships and working 3 jobs simultaneously." Marcus studied James's face carefully, searching for any signs of deception, but the older man's eyes remained sincere, filled with warmth and compassion. "Now," James said, reaching for a tablet and bringing it to life with a touch, "let's talk about your account. I've pulled up the file and I have to say, it's quite remarkable. The account was opened 6 months ago by your mother, correct?" "I think so," Marcus said hesitantly. "She never told me anything about it." I just got the card and a letter in the mail after she. He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. The pain still too raw. May I see the letter? James asked gently, his voice filled with empathy. Marcus carefully pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It had been read and reread so many times that the creases were beginning to tear and fray. He handed it to James with trembling fingers. James unfolded the letter carefully and began to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression gradually shifted from professional curiosity to deep, profound emotion. When he finished reading, he had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. Marcus, he said softly, his voice thick with barely suppressed emotion. Your mother was an extraordinary woman. Can you tell me what the money is? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't understand where it came from. We never had money. We could barely pay the rent each month. Mom worked all the time, but we were always broke. James looked down at the account details displayed on his tablet, then back at the worn, tear-stained letter in his hand, then finally back at Marcus, his heart aching for the young boy's pain and confusion. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. 6 months ago, your mother came to this bank. He paused, taking a deep breath. She didn't come to the main entrance, Marcus. She used the service entrance because she was here working as part of a cleaning crew. But somehow, she managed to get an appointment with one of our newer account managers, someone who was willing to actually listen to her story. What story? Marcus leaned forward eagerly, his eyes wide with anticipation. Your mother had been saving money for years, Marcus. Every single extra dollar she managed to scrape together went into a shoebox that she kept hidden under her bed. She told our account manager that she knew she was sick, that the doctors had told her she didn't have much time left, and she desperately wanted to make sure that you and your sister would be taken care of after she was gone. Marcus felt tears starting to well up in his eyes, blurring his vision. But we were so poor, he protested weakly. How could she have possibly saved that much money? She didn't, James said gently, his voice filled with compassion. The money in your account isn't from savings, Marcus. It's from a life insurance policy. Life insurance? Marcus's voice was barely audible. James nodded somberly. Your mother had been faithfully paying into a life insurance policy for over 10 years. Small payments, probably just $20 or $30 a month, that she somehow managed to find the money for even when you didn't have enough to eat. The policy had a final value of $50 million. The number was so incomprehensibly large that Marcus couldn't even begin to process it. $50 million. It wasn't real. Couldn't possibly be real. But there's more, James continued, pressing on gently. Your mother was very specific about how she wanted the money managed. She set up a trust with very particular conditions. The money is yours, but it's protected. You can't access the full amount until you're 25 years old. Until then, you have access to a monthly allowance that's more than enough to cover all of your expenses. Housing, food, education, everything you and your sister might possibly need. Marcus stared at James, utterly speechless, completely overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was hearing. His mother, who'd worked herself to the point of exhaustion, who'd worn the same 3 threadbare outfits for 5 long years, who'd sometimes gone without eating so that he and Emma could have dinner, had somehow managed to leave them millions of dollars. Why didn't she tell me? Marcus finally managed to ask, his voice choked with emotion. According to her letter, James said softly, touching the worn paper with reverence. She didn't want you to know she was dying. She didn't want your last memories of her to be filled with grief and fear. She wanted you to remember her as strong, as capable of taking care of you, even after she was gone. A knock at the door interrupted them, sparing Marcus from having to respond. A young woman entered the room carrying a tray laden with food. She sat it down on the table, gave Marcus a kind, reassuring smile, and then quietly left the room. Eat, James encouraged gently. We have much more to discuss, but you need food first. Marcus grabbed a sandwich and devoured it ravenously, eating as if he hadn't seen food in days, which, unfortunately, wasn't far from the truth. As he ate, James continued to explain more about the account, about the intricacies of the trust, about how Marcus would need a legal guardian to help manage things until he was old enough to do it himself. "What about my sister?" Marcus asked between hurried bites. "Emma. She's only 8 years old. Can this help her, too?" "The trust covers both of you, Marcus," James assured him, his voice filled with warmth. "Your mother made absolutely sure of that. Emma is included in all of the provisions." Marcus finished 2 sandwiches and was starting hungrily on a third when James's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at the screen and frowned slightly. "It seems Richard has been making calls," James said, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "He's very concerned about the legitimacy of your account. He's suggesting that we need to involve federal authorities, claiming that this might be some kind of money laundering scheme or even outright fraud." Marcus felt a wave of panic rising in his chest, threatening to overwhelm him. "But it's not my mom." "I know," James said firmly, his eyes conveying complete reassurance. "And I have all the necessary documentation to prove it. The insurance company paperwork, the trust documents, everything is completely legitimate and legal. Richard is just, well, Richard is having a difficult time accepting that. He was wrong." "He hates me," Marcus said quietly. "He doesn't hate you," James corrected him gently. "He hates being made to look foolish. There's a significant difference. Richard Blackwell has meticulously built his entire career on the perception of being the smartest person in any room, on his supposed ability to instantly assess people and situations. You challenged that fundamental aspect of his identity. You walked into his bank looking like someone he could easily dismiss, someone he could mock for the amusement of his wealthy clientele, and you turned out to be one of the wealthiest individuals in the building." "I'm not rich," Marcus protested, feeling uncomfortable with the label. I'm just me. You're a 12-year-old boy with a $47 million trust fund," James said, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "That unequivocally makes you very rich, whether you personally feel that way or not." Marcus looked down at his worn, dirty clothes, his duct-taped shoes, and his hands that remained stubbornly grimy despite his attempts to clean them. "I don't feel rich." "Give it time," James said reassuringly. "Now let's discuss the next steps." Richard Blackwell was not accustomed to being incorrect. In his carefully curated world, he was always several steps ahead, always in complete control, and always the one who dictated the course of events. However, as he sat at his desk in the lobby, acutely aware of curious clients subtly trying to observe him without being obvious, he experienced a sensation he hadn't encountered in decades: genuine uncertainty. His phone vibrated with a text message from James. *Conference room B now. And Richard, check your ego at the door. Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly. James Morrison had always been a minor irritant, a constant reminder that success in the banking industry didn't necessarily require the cutthroat ruthlessness that Richard had so carefully cultivated. James achieved success through kindness, through fostering genuine relationships with his clients, and through actually caring about the individuals whose money he managed. Richard had always considered this approach to be weak, inefficient, and outdated. But James had also never committed a blunder of the magnitude that Richard had just made. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt unusually long. Richard checked his reflection in the polished steel doors, straightening his tie and smoothing his hair, reinforcing the armor of perfection that had always protected him. Except today that armor had been breached, and he was unsure how to repair the damage. When he entered conference room B, the scene that greeted him was so unexpected that he actually paused in the doorway, momentarily stunned. Marcus was sitting at the table, ravenously consuming a sandwich with the kind of desperate hunger that suggested a history of missed meals. His face was noticeably cleaner now, indicating that someone had provided him with wet wipes. And in the enhanced lighting of the conference room, Richard noticed details he had previously overlooked. The boy clearly had his mother's eyes. Large, dark, and expressive, holding a depth of sadness that seemed far too profound for someone so young. His small hands revealed calluses, hinting at physical labor and adult responsibilities assumed far too early. James was seated across from Marcus, and spread out between them on the table were numerous documents. "Richard," James said, his tone neutral but firm. "Thank you for joining us. Please have a seat." Richard took a seat, feeling uncomfortably like he was the one being evaluated rather than the other way around. Marcus glanced at him briefly, then quickly averted his gaze, focusing intently on his sandwich. "I've thoroughly reviewed all the documentation pertaining to Marcus's account," James began, sliding a folder across the table towards Richard. "Everything is completely legitimate. The funds originate from a life insurance policy that his mother, Linda Chun, had been diligently paying into for over 10 years. The policy was disbursed 6 months ago upon her death. All applicable taxes have been paid, and all legal requirements have been met. This is not a case of fraud, money laundering, or any other illegal activity." Richard opened the folder and began to read. With each page he examined, his certainty diminished further. This wasn't some criminal enterprise. It was the legacy of a mother who had loved her children so deeply that she had sacrificed everything, quite literally, to ensure their well-being after her death. Linda Chun worked as a cleaning woman for several office buildings in Manhattan, James continued, including this one. As a matter of fact, she likely cleaned this very room dozens of times. Richard felt a chill settle in his stomach. He thought about all the nights he'd worked late, leaving messes for the cleaning crew to handle. Coffee cups left on desks and papers scattered carelessly. Had Marcus's mother been one of those invisible people who cleaned up after him? Had he ever even noticed her? "She worked 60 to 70 hours a week across 3 jobs," James went on. "Sometimes even more. Every spare dollar she earned went either to her children's needs or to this insurance policy. According to the insurance company's records, she never missed a single payment. Not once in 10 years. James paused, consulting his notes. Even when she was hospitalized for 3 days with pneumonia 4 years ago, she still made her payment on time. Marcus had stopped eating. His hands were clenched tightly in his lap, and Richard could see tears silently streaming down his face. The policy she chose was specifically designed to grow in value over time, James explained. It started small, but with compound interest and her consistent payments, it grew substantially. She structured everything through a trust to protect the children. Marcus and his sister, Emma, can't access the full amount until Marcus turns 25, but they do have access to a monthly allowance that will more than adequately cover all of their needs. Housing, food, education, medical care, everything. Richard examined the figures. The monthly allowance was $15,000, which was more than enough for 2 children to live comfortably, to attend good schools, and to have opportunities, but not so exorbitant that it could be easily wasted or mismanaged. "She thought of everything," James said softly, "down to the smallest detail. She even included specific provisions for Emma's education. College tuition is prepaid through a separate fund, and there are annual increases built into the allowance to account for inflation and the children's changing needs as they grow older." "How did she know how to set all this up?" Richard heard himself ask. "This is sophisticated estate planning. Most wealthy clients don't structure their trusts this well." "She researched," Marcus said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken since Richard had entered the room. "I remember her staying up late at the library. She said she was taking online courses to improve her English. But," his voice broke, "she was planning this. She was planning how to take care of us when she wasn't here anymore." Richard looked at this child, this boy he had mocked and humiliated in front of a lobby full of people, and felt something he had successfully avoided feeling for most of his adult life. Genuine shame. "The letter she left for Marcus explains everything," James said, picking up a worn piece of paper. "Would you like me to read it? Or?" Marcus nodded, wiping his eyes. "He should know. Everyone should know what kind of person my mom was." James cleared his throat and began to read. "My dearest Marcus. Asterisk, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And I'm so sorry I couldn't stay longer. I'm sorry for every birthday I'll miss, every graduation I won't see, every moment of your life I won't get to share. But I need you to know something important. I'm not sorry for the life I lived. Asterisk, people will look at what I did, working multiple jobs, being tired all the time, not being able to afford nice things, and they'll think I failed. They'll think I should have done something different, been someone different. But Marcus, I was exactly who I needed to be. I was your mother and Emma's mother, and that was the most important job I ever had. Asterisk, this money isn't an apology for not being rich when I was alive. It's a promise. A promise that you and Emma will have chances I never had, that you'll be able to choose what you want to be instead of just taking whatever work you can find, that you'll be able to dream without worrying about how to pay rent. Asterisk, but Marcus, and this is the most important part, money doesn't make you better than anyone else. It doesn't make you smarter or kinder or more deserving of respect. The world will treat you differently now, and you need to remember that the people who treat you well because you're rich are the same people who would have treated you badly if you were poor. Asterisk, be kind to people who work hard jobs. Remember that I was one of those people. Remember that every cleaning person, every cashier, every worker you meet is someone's mother or father or child. They all have dreams. They all have worth. Money is just money. It's what you do with it that matters. Asterisk, take care of your sister. Study hard. Build a good life. And most important, be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. To be happy. Asterisk, I love you more than all the stars in the sky. More than all the words in all the books ever written. Forever your mother, Lindachin. The silence that followed was profound. James carefully refolded the letter and handed it back to Marcus, who clutched it as if it were the most precious object in the world, which Richard realized it truly was. I'm sorry, Richard heard himself say. The words felt foreign in his mouth, unpracticed. Marcus, I'm genuinely sorry for how I treated you downstairs. Marcus looked at him with those old, knowing eyes. Are you sorry because you were wrong about the money? Or are you sorry because you were mean to a kid who didn't deserve it? The question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Richard wanted to claim that he was sorry for the right reasons, but the honest answer was more complicated. He was sorry because he'd been exposed as being wrong in front of his clients. He was sorry because this would damage his reputation. He was sorry because it was uncomfortable to confront his own cruelty. But looking at Marcus now, really seeing him for the first time, Richard felt something else stirring within him. A small voice that remembered being young, remembered his own mother, who had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table before his father's business finally took off. A voice he had been ignoring for so long that he had almost forgotten it existed. Both, Richard admitted. I'm sorry for both reasons, and I know that's not good enough, but it's the truth. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It wasn't forgiveness. Richard didn't expect forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. So, what happens now? Marcus asked, looking between the 2 men. Now, James said, we set you up properly. You'll need a legal guardian until you're 18. Do you have any family? Marcus shook his head. Just Emma. Our mom was an only child, and our dad. He trailed off, his voice filled with unspoken grief. We don't have anyone. Then we'll work with social services to ensure you and Emma have proper care, James said. But the trust provides funding for guardian compensation, so we should be able to find someone good, someone your mother would have approved of. We'll also need to move you out of your current housing situation immediately. Richard found himself speaking up, surprising both Marcus and James. What? Both Marcus and James looked at him in surprise. The boy is one of our most valuable clients. We have a responsibility to ensure his well-being. It wasn't entirely altruistic. Richard was already considering how this story could be spun, how a redemption arc might actually benefit his reputation, but it wasn't entirely selfish either. For the first time in a very long time, Richard Blackwell was considering someone else's needs before his own. There's a residential building 2 blocks from here, Richard continued. Luxury apartments, full security, excellent schools nearby. The bank owns several units. I can have one prepared for Marcus and his sister within 48 hours. That's actually very generous, James said, clearly suspicious of Richard's motives but unable to deny that it was a good solution. Marcus looked overwhelmed. I can't. That's too much. I just needed to check my balance so I could buy groceries. Marcus? Richard said, and for once, his voice held no condescension, No mockery, just simple honesty. Your life just changed completely. The money your mother left you means you never have to worry about groceries again. You never have to worry about rent or utilities or any of the things that kept you up at night. Your mother made sure of that. But I don't know how to be rich, Marcus whispered. I don't know how to live like that. Then you'll learn, James said gently. One day at a time, and we'll help you. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the Bronx as Marcus and Richard arrived at the building Marcus had called home for the past 3 years. Richard's luxury sedan looked absurdly out of place on that street, like a spaceship that had inadvertently landed in the wrong dimension. Richard had insisted on accompanying Marcus to collect his sister and their belongings. James had suggested sending a professional moving service, but Richard had surprised them both by volunteering to go personally. The boy shouldn't have to face this alone, he had said, though he suspected his real motivation was more complicated than simple kindness. Now, sitting in his car and looking at the building, Richard felt his carefully constructed worldview continuing to crumble. The building was a 5-story structure of crumbling brick and broken windows. Fire escapes hung precariously from the facade, with rust eating through the metal supports. Trash bags were piled high on the sidewalk, torn open by rats or stray dogs. Graffiti covered every available surface, some of it artistic, most of it just angry scrawls marking territory. "This is where you live?" Richard asked, then immediately regretted the question. Of course, this was where Marcus lived. Where else would a child whose mother worked 3 jobs be able to afford? "4th floor, Marcus said quietly. "The elevator hasn't worked in 2 years, so we have to take the stairs." They got out of the car, and Richard locked it 3 times, checking each door handle meticulously. A group of teenagers sitting on the front steps watched them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Richard felt acutely aware of his expensive suit, his Rolex watch, and the leather briefcase he was carrying. He might as well have painted a target on his back. Marcus nodded to the teenagers. "Hey, Carlos, Miguel." "Marcus." One of the boys jumped up, concern evident on his face. "Man, where you been? Emma's been crying all day. Mrs. Rodriguez has been watching her, but she keeps asking for you." "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "I had to take care of something important. I'm here now." The teenager's eyes shifted to Richard, taking in the expensive suit with obvious distrust. "Who's this?" "Someone who's helping me," Marcus said simply. "It's okay, Carlos. Promise." The interior of the building was even worse than the exterior. The hallway was dark, and half the light fixtures were broken. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, cooking grease, and something else Richard couldn't quite identify but that made his stomach turn. The walls were water-stained, and the floor tiles were cracked and missing in places. They climbed the stairs, passing other residents. An elderly woman carrying groceries, whom Marcus helped even though Richard could see the boy was exhausted. A young mother with a baby on her hip and 2 toddlers clinging to her legs, who smiled wearily at Marcus. And a man in a security guard uniform heading out for the night shift. Each time, Marcus greeted them by name. Each time they asked about Emma, about how he was managing. And each time Richard felt smaller and smaller. These people had nothing. They lived in conditions that Richard wouldn't have tolerated for a storage unit, but they cared about each other in a way that Richard's wealthy clients never did. They were a community looking out for one another because they understood that survival required solidarity. When they reached the 4th floor, Marcus stopped in front of a door with peeling paint. The number 4C hung crooked, held by a single screw. He pulled out a key, then paused. "It's not much," Marcus said, not looking at Richard. "I know what you're thinking, but it was home." "I'm not thinking anything," Richard lied. In truth, his mind was racing with thoughts, none of them flattering to himself. Marcus opened the door. The apartment was tiny, maybe 400 square feet in total. There was a main room that served as the living room, dining room, and kitchen all at once. 2 doors led off to what Richard assumed were bedrooms, though he suspected they were barely larger than closets. The furniture was old and worn, held together with determination and duct tape. But the apartment was clean, meticulously clean, and decorated with obvious love. Children's drawings covered the walls. A small bookshelf held well-worn paperbacks arranged by color. A vase of plastic flowers sat on a table positioned to catch the afternoon light from the single window. Marcus! A little girl burst out of one of the bedrooms and threw herself at Marcus. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with the same dark eyes as her brother. Her clothes were clean but patched, her hair pulled back into braids that were starting to come loose. "Emma," Marcus said, hugging her tight. "I'm sorry I was gone so long. I'm so sorry." "Mrs. Rodriguez said you went to take care of grown-up stuff," Emma said, her voice muffled against Marcus's shoulder. "I was scared you weren't coming back." "I'll always come back," Marcus promised. "Always. But Emma, I have something important to tell you. Something about Mom." An older woman emerged from the other bedroom. Mrs. Rodriguez, Richard assumed. She was in her 60s, with kind eyes and worn hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "Marcus," she said with obvious relief. "Thank God. Emma's been so worried." Her eyes moved to Richard, instantly suspicious. "Who's your friend?" "This is Mr. Blackwell," Marcus said. "He's from the bank. Mom left us some money, Mrs. Rodriguez." "A lot of money, Mrs." Rodriguez's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, disbelief, hope, and then something that looked like grief. "Linda," she whispered. "That woman, she was always planning, always thinking ahead." She wiped her eyes quickly. "How much money, Miko?" Marcus looked at Richard helplessly. Even after spending hours discussing it, he still couldn't quite wrap his mind around the number. "Enough that they'll never have to worry again," Richard said gently. "Enough for excellent schools, a safe home, everything they need." Mrs. Rodriguez pressed her hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. "Linda, you beautiful, crazy woman. You actually did it." "Did what?" Emma asked, looking confused. Marcus knelt down to his sister's level. "Emma, remember how Mom always said she was going to make sure we were okay? That we'd always have what we needed?" Emma nodded solemnly. "She did it," Marcus said, his own tears starting to flow. "She left us enough money that we can have a nice apartment and you can go to a good school, and we can have food whenever we're hungry." And his voice broke. "She took care of us, Emma. Even after she was gone, she's still taking care of us." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she asked the question that broke Richard's heart. "Does this mean we don't have to be hungry anymore?" Richard turned away, unable to watch, unable to bear the weight of that simple question. These children, these babies, had been living with hunger as a constant companion. While he'd been spending hundreds of dollars on business lunches he barely touched, these kids had been wondering if they'd have dinner. "No, baby," Marcus said, pulling Emma close again. "We never have to be hungry again." Mrs. Rodriguez was openly sobbing now. "Your mother. She used to come home at 3 in the morning, and she'd still find the energy to braid Emma's hair for school. She'd work doubles at the laundromat on weekends and never complained. Not once. We all knew she was sick, but she kept working, kept smiling, kept telling us she was fine." "She wasn't fine," Marcus said quietly. "She was dying, and she knew it, but she didn't want us to know because she didn't want us to be scared." Richard finally turned back to face the room. "She was protecting you," he said. "Right to the very end. She was protecting you." Emma looked up at Richard for the first time, studying him with the directness that only children possess. "Are you going to help my brother?" "Yes," Richard said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. "I'm going to help both of you." "Okay," Emma said simply, with the easy trust of a child who'd been taught that most adults were good people trying their best. "Can we bring Bunny?" She held up a stuffed rabbit that had clearly seen better days. One ear was hanging by a thread, the fur was matted and thin, and Richard suspected it had been repaired dozens of times. "We can bring everything you want," Marcus assured her. They spent the next hour packing. There wasn't much to pack. A few changes of clothes each. Some books, Emma's stuffed animals, Marcus's school papers, and photographs of their mother. Everything they owned fit into 4 garbage bags and 1 small suitcase. Richard watched as Marcus carefully took down the drawings from the walls and Emma collected her crayons and the notebook where she practiced writing her name. He watched as they said goodbye to Mrs. Rodriguez, who made them promise to call her, to visit, and to never forget where they came from. "You're good kids," Mrs. Rodriguez told them, hugging them both fiercely. "Your mama raised you right. Don't let money change that." "We won't," Marcus promised. As they carried the bags down the stairs, Richard insisted on taking the heaviest ones. Despite Marcus's protests, other residents came out to say goodbye, word having spread quickly about the children's good fortune. There was no jealousy in their faces, only genuine happiness. These people understood what it meant to struggle, and they were celebrating this rare victory. Carlos and his friends helped carry bags to the car. An elderly man gave Marcus $20 for emergencies, refusing to take it back even when Marcus tried to explain that he didn't need it anymore. A young woman gave Emma a chocolate bar for the road. This, Richard realized, was what community looked like, what caring for your neighbors actually meant. Not charity galas where wealthy people wrote checks to feel better about themselves, but real human connection, people taking care of each other because it was the right thing to do. When they were finally in the car, bags loaded, Richard started the engine but didn't immediately drive away. He looked at Marcus and Emma in the rearview mirror. These two children who had lost everything but still had their dignity, their kindness, and their fundamental decency. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, "for coming with me, for not making me do this alone." Richard gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Marcus, I need to say something, and I need you to really hear it." Both children looked at him attentively. "What I did to you this morning at the bank, humiliating you, mocking you, treating you like you were nothing, was unforgivable. I've spent my entire career judging people based on their clothes, their addresses, their bank accounts. I've convinced myself that money equals worth, that success equals superiority." He turned to look at them directly. "But your mother, who spent her life cleaning toilets, who worked herself to exhaustion, who never knew the luxury of expensive clothes or fancy cars. She was worth more than 1,000 men like me. She understood something I had forgotten, that a person's true value isn't measured by what they possess, but by what they give to the world. Mom always said that being kind doesn't cost a thing," Emma offered shyly. "Your mother was a truly wise woman," Richard affirmed, "and I'm going to truly try to be better. To be the kind of person who would have recognized your mother's worth, who would have seen your worth, regardless of the numbers in your bank account." Marcus nodded slowly, a hint of understanding in his eyes. That's all she would have ever wanted, for people to strive to be better. Richard put the car in gear and eased away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, he watched the residents of the building waving goodbye, Mrs. Rodriguez dabbing at her eyes with her apron. As they drove toward Manhattan, toward the luxurious apartment that would become Marcus and Emma's new home, Richard made a promise to himself. He would help these children, yes, but even more importantly, he would allow them to help him remember what truly mattered in life, to help him become the kind of person who saw value in everyone, not just those who could afford his high-end services. It was, he realized with growing clarity, the most crucial education he would ever receive. And his teachers were a bright-eyed 12-year-old and an insightful 8-year-old. 3 months had passed since that fateful Friday morning when Marcus Chen, his face smudged with dirt and his heart filled with fear, had walked into Blackwell and Associates private banking. 3 months since Richard Blackwell's carefully constructed world had been irrevocably shattered by a brave 12-year-old boy and a heartfelt letter from a mother whose love for her children knew no bounds. The luxury apartment on Park Avenue had been transformed into something that finally felt like a real home. Emma's vibrant drawings now adorned an entire wall, each one a testament to her burgeoning creativity. Richard had insisted on having them professionally framed, despite Marcus's protests that they were just crayon sketches. The furniture, while still undeniably expensive, had been carefully selected by Marcus for comfort rather than mere impressiveness. Stuffed animals now shared space with an ever-growing collection of new books, a testament to their growing sense of security. The kitchen, which had initially seemed impossibly large, was now frequently filled with the warm, inviting aroma of Emma learning to bake cookies under the watchful eye of their new guardian, Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson, a retired school teacher in her late 50s, had tragically lost her own daughter to cancer a decade earlier. When the social worker had introduced her to Marcus and Emma, she'd looked at them with the same fierce protectiveness that Linda Chan had always displayed. Within a week, she had moved into the apartment's guest room, seamlessly integrating herself as the steady, loving presence the children so desperately needed. But the most profound and dramatic transformation had not occurred within the confines of the apartment. It had taken place within Richard Blackwell himself. The morning after settling Marcus and Emma into their new home, Richard had arrived at the bank at 5 a.m., a full 2 hours earlier than his usual arrival time. He'd walked through every floor of the towering building, truly observing it for the first time in years. He'd noticed the silent cleaning crew, diligently emptying trash cans and vacuuming carpets while the rest of the world was still asleep. He'd watched them move through the offices like unseen ghosts, their presence largely invisible and unacknowledged. At 6 a.m., he'd done something he never would have imagined doing before. He'd introduced himself to the cleaning crew supervisor. "Good morning," he'd said to a startled woman named Gloria. "I'm Richard Blackwell. I own this bank, and I'd like to know your name and the names of everyone on your team." Gloria had stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. In her 20 years of cleaning this building, no executive had ever spoken to her directly, let alone the CEO. But Richard had been patient, genuinely interested. He'd learned every name, asked about their families, their lives, their struggles. And when Gloria had finally opened up, sharing the impossible expectations, the poverty wages, the complete lack of benefits or respect, Richard had listened with the same focused attention he usually reserved for his billionaire clients. By Monday morning, he'd called an emergency board meeting. "Gentlemen," he'd announced to the assembled board members, "I'm proposing some significant changes to how we operate this institution." What followed was the most contentious board meeting in the bank's 100-year history. Richard proposed tripling the wages of the cleaning and maintenance staff. He proposed providing comprehensive health insurance, paid vacation time, and retirement benefits. He proposed creating a scholarship fund for the children of service workers who aspired to pursue higher education. "Have you completely lost your mind?" one board member had exclaimed in disbelief. "These costs will drastically impact our profit margins." "Good," Richard had replied calmly, his voice unwavering. "Our profit margins are obscene. We can certainly afford to treat the people who make this building function like human beings, rather than disposable resources." The vote had been incredibly close, but Richard had ultimately prevailed, albeit barely. 2 board members had resigned in protest. Richard had thanked them for their service and hadn't bothered to conceal his relief at their departure. Then, he'd begun implementing sweeping changes to how the bank treated all of its employees, not just the service workers. Exit interviews revealed a disturbing pattern of discrimination, favoritism, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear-based management. Richard had promptly fired 3 senior managers who had been responsible for creating these toxic environments. He'd implemented transparent promotion criteria, ensuring fairness and equal opportunity. And, most importantly, he'd started actively listening to his employees, rather than simply issuing orders from on high. The financial press had been merciless in their criticism. "Blackwell goes soft," one sensational headline screamed. "Banking executives' strange transformation worries investors," another declared. Richard's peers at other banks had called him privately, discreetly inquiring if he was perhaps experiencing some kind of mental breakdown. He told them all the same thing, his voice filled with newfound conviction. "I met someone who taught me what real wealth truly looks like, and it wasn't reflected in a bank account." Now, sitting in his office on a crisp October afternoon, Richard was reviewing the latest quarterly reports when his assistant buzzed him. "Mr. Blackwell, Marcus and Emma Chun are here to see you." Richard smiled, a gesture he found himself performing much more frequently these days. "Send them in." Marcus and Emma entered, and Richard still marveled at the incredible transformation he witnessed. Marcus now wore clothes that actually fit him properly. His face was clean and healthy looking, and most importantly, the constant fear that had once haunted his eyes had been replaced by something else entirely. Not happiness. Exactly, the profound grief of losing his mother was still too recent for that, but a sense of peace, security, and even a glimmer of hope. Emma was thriving. She'd enrolled in a new school where she was earning straight A's in every subject. She'd made new friends, genuine connections that brought her joy. She'd gained weight, healthy weight that came from regular, nutritious meals and the absence of constant worry about where her next meal would come from. She was finally getting the chance to simply be 8 years old, to experience the carefree joy of childhood that she so richly deserved. "Mr. Blackwell," Emma said, running to embrace him in a warm hug. She'd quickly overcome her initial shyness around him within the first week of their acquaintance. "I got 100% on my math test." "That's absolutely wonderful, Emma," Richard said, his voice filled with genuine delight. "Did you bring it to show me?" She eagerly pulled the paper from her backpack, her face beaming with pride. Richard made a deliberate show of examining it carefully, then reached into his desk drawer and retrieved a gold star sticker, something he'd started keeping specifically for Emma's visits. "This absolutely deserves a place in your achievement book," he said solemnly, handing it to her. Emma carefully placed the sticker on her test, then settled into one of the leather chairs, pulling out a book to read while the adults talked. Marcus took the other chair, his expression more serious and thoughtful. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," he began. "Of course, Marcus. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking a lot about what my mom really wanted," Marcus continued, his voice earnest. "Not just for me and Emma, but something bigger than that. She wrote in her letter that money is just money. It's what you actually do with it that truly matters." Richard nodded slowly, waiting patiently for him to elaborate. "I want to start a foundation," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength and conviction as he spoke. "For kids like me and Emma. Kids whose parents are working themselves to the bone, but still can't quite make ends meet. I want to help them." Richard felt a lump form in his throat, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "That's a beautiful idea, Marcus. What kind of help are you envisioning?" "Everything," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "School supplies, tutoring, food assistance, helping parents get access to better-paying jobs. But also, and this is the really important part, I want to help people actually see those kids. Really see them. The way you didn't see me at first." The words stung, but Richard didn't flinch from them, accepting the truth of the boy's statement. "You're absolutely right, Marcus. What did you have in mind specifically?" Marcus pulled out a well-worn notebook, revealing that he had clearly been planning this meticulously. "I've been researching other foundations, talking to Mrs. Patterson about it. I want to call it the Linda Chun Foundation for Working Families, and I want to donate $10 million from my trust to get it started." Richard blinked, momentarily speechless. "Marcus, that's a very substantial amount of money." "I know," Marcus said, his gaze unwavering, "but it's what Mom would have wanted. She didn't save all that money just so I could buy expensive stuff. She saved it so I could actually make a real difference in the world. Do you understand that this is a long-term commitment?" Richard asked carefully, wanting to ensure that Marcus fully grasped the magnitude of his decision. Running a foundation is serious work. It requires careful oversight, dedicated administration, and meticulous planning. "I know," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "That's why I was hoping that you would help. Not just with the money part, but with making sure it actually helps people in a tangible way. You understand how to make things work in the business world." Richard remained quiet for a long moment, thoughtfully considering the boy's proposal. 3 months ago, he would have summarily dismissed this as a naive child's fantasy, but he'd learned enough since then to recognize that Marcus possessed a profound understanding, something that Richard himself was still in the process of learning. "I would be deeply honored to help," Richard said, his voice sincere. "On one condition." Marcus looked wary, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What condition?" "That you allow me to donate $10 million of my own money to match yours," Richard said, his voice resolute. "Your mother taught me a lesson that I desperately needed to learn. This is my chance to actually do something meaningful with it." Marcus's eyes widened in astonishment. "You do that, Mr. Blackwell?" "Yes, Marcus. 3 months ago, I was a man who measured success solely by the size of my bank account and the fear in my employees' eyes. I was deeply miserable, even though I couldn't admit it to myself. Your mother's letter, the way she loved you and Emma, the way she sacrificed everything for you, it showed me what I'd been missing all along." Richard stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the sprawling cityscape of Manhattan. "I've spent the last 3 months trying to be a better person, treating people with the dignity and respect they deserve, actually caring about the employees who work for me. And you know what I've discovered?" "What?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "I'm happier than I've been in 20 years, Richard said simply, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "I sleep better. I actually enjoy coming to work. I've even reconnected with my daughter. Did I tell you I have a daughter? She's 25 years old. And for years, she wouldn't even speak to me because I'd been such a terrible father. But she called me last week. She said she'd heard about the changes I was making and she wanted to meet for coffee." Marcus smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Did you go?" "We had coffee for 3 hours, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. 3 hours of actually talking, actually listening to each other. I told her all about you and Emma, about your mother. I told her I was trying to learn how to be a better person." "What did she say?" Marcus asked, eager to hear the outcome. "She said it was about time," Richard replied, a chuckle escaping his lips. "But she also said she was proud of me. Do you know how long it's been since anyone said they were proud of me? Not impressed by my money or my success, but actually proud of me as a person." Emma looked up from her book, her young face radiating sincerity. "I'm proud of you, Mr. Blackwell." The simple statement, delivered with such sincere conviction, nearly undid Richard completely. He had to clear his throat several times before he could manage to respond. "Thank you, Emma. That means more to me than you could possibly know." James Morrison appeared in the doorway, knocking gently. "Sorry to interrupt, but Richard, the Channel 7 news crew is here for the interview." "Interview?" Marcus asked, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Richard had been planning to tell Marcus about this, but the boy's proposal for the foundation had completely derailed his plans. "I've been asked to do an interview about the changes we've made at the bank. I was going to ask if you'd be willing to participate, but you're under absolutely no obligation to do so." "What kind of interview?" Marcus asked cautiously, his voice guarded. "They want to talk about how encountering you changed my perspective on leadership and human dignity," Richard explained. "But I won't do it without your explicit permission. Your story is your own to share." Marcus thought for a long moment, carefully weighing the potential consequences. "Will it help other people? Other kids who are struggling?" "I believe it could," Richard said honestly. "It might inspire other business leaders to examine how they treat their employees. It might help people understand that everyone deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their job or their income." "Then I'll do it," Marcus decided, his voice filled with newfound determination. "But I want to talk about my mom, about who she really was." The interview took place in the bank's conference room. The reporter, a woman named Sarah Chun, no relation to Marcus, although the coincidence made everyone pause, was professional, yet genuinely warm. She'd clearly done her research and approached the story with genuine interest, rather than simply looking for a sensational scandal. "Mr. Blackwell," Sarah began, 3 months ago, you were widely known as one of the most ruthless executives in private banking. Your management style was often described as cutthroat and intimidating. What changed?" Richard looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "I met a 12-year-old boy who showed me that I'd been measuring success with completely the wrong metrics," Richard said, his voice resonating with sincerity. "Marcus walked into my bank looking for help, and I humiliated him in front of a room full of people simply because he didn't look wealthy. I judged him based solely on his appearance, his circumstances, his apparent poverty. And then," Sarah prompted, her pen poised to capture every word. "And then I discovered that he was actually one of the wealthiest clients in the entire building," Richard said, his voice filled with a touch of self-reproach. But more importantly than that, I learned about his mother. Linda Chun worked 3 incredibly demanding jobs cleaning offices and doing laundry. She wore the same few outfits for years. She sometimes went without eating so that her children could have dinner. And while she was doing all of that, she was building a future for her kids that was far more impressive than anything I'd ever accomplished. Marcus took over the narrative, talking about his mother with a poignant mixture of pride and grief that was heartbreaking to witness. He spoke of her countless sacrifices, her unwavering love, and her final, selfless gift to her children. Emma chimed in occasionally with cherished memories of their mother braiding her hair before school, and of tucking them in at night, no matter how utterly exhausted she was. "The money is wonderful," Marcus said, his voice clear and strong. "It means that Emma and I don't have to worry about food, or housing, or education. But the real gift my mom gave us was showing us how to be good people, how to work hard, how to care about others, how to never treat anyone as less than human." Sarah turned to Richard, her gaze penetrating. "And that lesson inspired you to make significant changes to how you operate your business." "It inspired me to become the kind of person I should have been all along," Richard corrected, his voice firm. "We've tripled wages for our service workers, implemented comprehensive benefits packages, created scholarship programs, and fundamentally transformed our corporate culture from one based on fear to one based on respect and mutual understanding." "Your critics say you've gone soft," Sarah noted, a hint of skepticism in her voice. "They argue that you're sacrificing profitability for the sake of political correctness." Richard smiled, a genuine smile that conveyed his newfound sense of peace. "Our profitability has actually increased. It turns out that when you treat employees well, they tend to work harder, stay longer, and care far more about the company's overall success." "Who knew?" The sarcasm in his voice made Sarah laugh. "But more than that," Richard continued, his expression becoming serious once again, "I honestly don't care what my critics say. I spent 45 years desperately caring about what other wealthy men thought of me, and it made me utterly miserable. Now, I care far more about whether I can look at myself in the mirror and feel proud of who I am. And, for the first time in decades, I actually can." The interview continued for another hour, delving into the specific details of the foundation that Marcus wanted to start, the concrete changes that Richard had implemented at the bank, and the broader implications for corporate leadership in general. When it was finally over, and the news crew had packed up their equipment, Marcus and Emma prepared to leave. "Thank you for doing that," Marcus said to Richard, his voice filled with gratitude, "for being willing to talk about what happened." "Thank you for giving me the chance to be better," Richard replied, his voice sincere and heartfelt. "You and Emma, and your mother, you saved my life. I know that sounds incredibly dramatic, but it's the absolute truth. I was living a life devoid of meaning, without purpose, without any real human connection. You gave all of that back to me." Emma hugged him once more, her small arms wrapping tightly around him. "You're a good person, Mr. Blackwell." "I'm trying to be," Richard said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "Every single day I'm trying." After they had left, Richard sat alone in his office as the sun began to set over the glittering skyline of Manhattan. He thought about Linda Chun, a woman he had never actually met, but who had completely and irrevocably changed his life. He thought about how many other Linda Chens were out there, working in those invisible jobs, sacrificing everything for their children, and never receiving the recognition or respect that they so richly deserved. He picked up his phone and called James Morrison. "James, I want to significantly expand our employee support programs," he said, his voice filled with purpose. "I want to create a dedicated child care center right here in the building. I want to offer comprehensive educational assistance, not just to our employees, but also to their children. I want—" "Richard," James interrupted gently, his voice calm and reassuring. "Slow down. We can absolutely do all of those things, but we need to plan everything carefully and strategically." "I know," Richard said, his voice filled with urgency. "But I also know that every single day we wait is another day that someone just like Linda Chun is working themselves to exhaustion without the support they so desperately need. I simply don't want to wait any longer." "Then we won't," James said simply, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We'll start planning everything tomorrow morning." Richard hung up the phone and turned to his computer. He had several important emails to write. One to his daughter, suggesting that they have dinner together this weekend. Another to his ex-wife, offering a sincere apology for decades of emotional absence. And yet another to the employees he'd mistreated over the years, offering genuine apologies and, where possible, restitution for his past actions. He had a lot of work to do, a lot of years to make up for, a lot of damage to repair. But, for the first time in his life, Richard Blackwell was finally doing work that actually mattered. And it had all started with a dirty, disheveled kid asking to check his balance. And a millionaire who'd finally learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives you touched, the kindness you showed, and the inherent dignity you extended to every single human being. The screen had initially displayed a number, $47 million, that had frozen Richard's smile in place. But it was what happened afterwards, the profound lesson he learned from a brave young boy, his resilient sister, and their mother's unwavering love, that had ultimately thawed his frozen heart. And that transformative experience was worth far more than any amount of money could ever be.